Hello, seventh graders. This is Mrs. Harding here with you and the book Lyddie. And I hope that you have a copy of this book that you can have in your hands and follow along with me as I read aloud chapter 3. I'm also going to pause at certain parts and do what's called a think aloud, where I say out loud things that I could be thinking while I'm reading to help you see what you may want to do as you're reading to help you figure out words you don't know, or just to make sense of the story or to relate to the characters. So please have your book with you if you do have the book and open to page 18, which is the beginning of chapter 3, and follow along with me while I read. Chapter 3 is called Cutler's Tavern. Lyddie stood outside the gate, waiting until Luke and his wagon disappeared around the curve of the road. Then she watched a pair of swallows dive and soar around the huge chimney in the center of the main house. The tavern was larger than the Stevensons' farmhouse. Addition after addition, porch, shed, and a couple of barns, the end one at least 4 stories high. The whole complex, recently painted with a mix of red and buttermilk, stood against the sky like a row of giant beets popped clear of the earth. So stopping there, I'm just thinking that I'm trying to picture this setting in my mind, and it seems like a pretty busy place, especially the part about the building having several stories. So this sounds like a lot different than where Lyddie's used to, and it may be intimidating to her. And I'm just wondering how that might affect her and her state of mind at this point. The pastures, a lush new green, were dotted with sheep and fat milk cows. There was a huge sugar maple in front of what must have been the parlor door, and another by the porch, which from the presence of churns and cooling pans must lead into the kitchen. Once I walk in that gate, I ain't free any more, she thought. No matter how handsome the house, once I enter I'm a servant girl, no more than a black slave. She had been queen of the cabin, and the straggly fields and sugar bush up there on the hill, but now someone else would call the tune. How could her mother have done such a thing? She was sure her father would be horrified. She and the Charlie drudges on someone else's place? It didn't matter that plenty poor people put out their children for hire to save having to feed them. She and Charlie could have fed themselves. Just one more good harvest, one more sugaring, that was all they needed, and they could have stayed together. She was startled out of her dreaming by a hideous roar, and before she could figure out what animal could have made such a noise, a stagecoach appeared, drawn by 2 ponds of sweating Morgan horses, shaking their great heads, showing their fierce teeth, saliva foaming on their iron bits. The coach had rounded the curve, its horn bellowing. Okay, that's kind of confusing. She was startled out of her dreaming by a hideous roar. Let's reread that. She was startled out of her dreaming by a hideous roar, and before she could figure out what animal could have made such a noise, a stagecoach appeared. Okay, so she was kind of like daydreaming and thinking about things and then got kind of awakened from that by the stagecoach. So a stagecoach came and that's what made the big loud sound. A stagecoach is a carriage pulled by horses. Okay, the driver was yelling, and then just in time she realized that he was yelling at her. She jumped hard against the wall. He was still yelling back at her as he pulled out the reins, and the coach itself now on the very spot where she had been standing seconds before. Should she apologize? No, he wasn't paying her any attention now. He was turning the team over to a boy who had run out of the shed. A woman was hurrying out of the kitchen door to welcome the passengers, who were climbing stiffly from the coach. Lyddie stared. They were very grand looking. One of the gentlemen, a man in a beaver hat and frilled shirt, turned to hand a woman down the coach step. The lady's face was hidden by a fancy straw bonnet, the brim decorated with roses that matched her gown. Was it silk? Lyddie couldn't be sure, never having seen a real silk dress before, but it was smooth and pink like a baby's cheek. Around her shoulders the lady wore a shawl woven in a deeper shade of pink. Lyddie marveled that the woman would wear something so delicate for a ride to the Northland in a dusty coach. So right now it seems like Lyddie is in awe of how fancy these people are dressed, and I'm wondering how that's making her feel. Let's read on and we'll see if we get any indicator of how she's comparing herself to these people. Safely on the ground, the woman lifted her head and looked about her. Her face was thin and white, her features elegant. She caught Lyddie's eyes and smiled. It was a very nice smile, not at all haughty. Lyddie realized that she had been staring. She closed her mouth and quickly looked away. Then the encounter was over, for the stout woman who had come out of the kitchen door was hustling the lady, her escort, and the 2 other passengers through the low gate and round to the main door at the northern end of the tavern. Suddenly she saw Lyddie. She came over to the wall and whispered hoarsely across it to her. "What are you doing here?" She was looking Lyddie up and down as she asked, as though Lyddie were a stray dog who had wandered too close to the house. Lyddie was aware, as she might not have been minutes before, that she had no bonnet, and that her hair and braids were dusty from the road. She crossed her arms, trying to cover her worn brown homespun with the gunny sack. The dress was tight across her newly budding chest, and it hung unevenly to just above her knees in a ragged hem. Her brown feet were bare, her outgrown boots still slung over her shoulder. She should have remembered to put them on before she got off Luke's wagon. So right there you can see the comparison of herself to the more fancy people she just saw. Homespun is not a word that you've probably heard of that, and it's not a word I'm super familiar with either. So if we try to think about what that could mean, we could use the context. She crossed her arms trying to cover her worn brown homespun. So she's covering herself, so it's probably a type of clothing. I'm also thinking about how spin is similar to, or spun is similar to spin, and so it's probably come from that word. And I know like at home they could spin clothes or make clothes. So I'm wondering if this just means her clothes are worn out and they're probably homemade. At the time, if you didn't really have a lot of money, you would make your own clothes, and only people who had enough money could buy them from someone else. So she probably has homemade clothes that are old, and it says there's a ragged hem. So I bet she's feeling probably insecure compared to the people who are dressed so fancy. Self-consciously, oh, right there it tells us she feels self-conscious. I felt like that before. Have you ever felt that way? Like you didn't really fit in, that you looked different than other people? I definitely have. Self-consciously, she raised her sleeve and wiped her nose and mouth under the woman's unforgiving stare. Go along, the woman was saying. This is a respectable tavern, not the township poor farm. Lyddie could feel the rage oozing up like sap on a morning Monday, a March morning. She cleared her throat and stood up straight. "I'm Lydia Worthen," she said. "I got a letter from my mother." The woman looked horrified. "You're the new girl?" "I reckon I am," Lyddie said, clutching her gunny sack more tightly. "Well, I've no time to bother with you now," the woman said. "Go into the kitchen and ask let me see, Tripthena to tell you where you can wash. We keep a clean place here." Lyddie bit her lip to keep from answering back. She looked straight into the woman's face until the woman blinked and turned, running a little to catch up with the guests who were waiting for her at the main door. Why do you think Lyddie bit her lip from answering back? It's almost like she was physically trying to keep herself from talking, maybe, like she bit her lip to make herself not talk. I wonder. All right. The cook was busy as the mistress and not eager to involve herself with the dusty new servant just when she was putting the meal on the table. Sit over there. Tryphena shook her head at the low stool near the huge fireplace. Lydia would rather have stood along the long, bumpy ride in the Stevensons' wagon, but she chose not to cause a problem with the cook as well as the mistress in the first 10 minutes of her employment. Oh man, can you imagine that? Relating to the characters really helps you enjoy the story more and also understand what's going on and the character's perspective more. So if you can try to think of a time that you felt uneasy in a situation or where you didn't feel like you belonged and that maybe you stuck out in a certain way. Maybe you were the new kid, or maybe you joined a soccer team for the first time or another sport for the first time and didn't really feel like you belonged or you were out of place. Um, you can maybe relate a little bit to Lyddie, even though you probably have never been sold, right, and gone to work someplace in her exact situation, but you can also relate in a different way, like anytime that you have felt out of place, right? And that can help you relate to the character more and understand the story better. Okay, so diving into the middle of page 21. The kitchen was 3 times the size of the whole Worthing cabin. Its center was the huge fireplace. Lyddie could have stretched out full length in front of it and put her head and toes would have remained on the hearth with room to spare. So it's big. Built into the right side of the brick chimney was a huge beehive-shaped oven, and the smell of the fresh-baked loaves made Lyddie forget the generous dinner she'd shared noontime. The trouble with eating good, she thought later, is that you get used to it. You think you ought to have it regular, not just for a treat. Over the fire hung a kettle so large that both the babies could have bathed in it together. It was bubbling with a meat stew chock full of carrots and onions and beans and potatoes and a thick brown broth. There were chickens turning on a spit, which looked to be magically going round and round on its own. But as Lyddie's eyes followed a leather strap upward, she saw above the fireplace the mechanism from which hung a huge metal pendulum. She wished her father could see it. He would make one perhaps from wood, and then no one would have to tediously turn the spit by hand. But perhaps it was something you'd have to order from the blacksmith, in which case it was likely to be so dear that only the rich could afford one. She couldn't remember seeing one at the Stevensons, and they were rich enough to own their own loom. "Move!" the cook said. The large woman was beginning to take the food from the fire. She gave Lyddie a quick glance. "Lucky you're so plain. Guess wouldn't leave the last girl be." She was ladling stew into a large serving basin. "Wouldn't have no trouble with you, will 'e?" Lyddie picked up the stool and moved it to the center of the room. She knew she was no beauty, never had been, but she was a fierce worker. She'd prove that to the women. Should she offer to help now? But the cook was too busy moving the wood from the fire to the long wooden table. Moving the food from the fire to the long wooden table in the center of the room to pay her any mind. Lyddie scrunched her body into itself and tucked her bare feet under the low stool, fearful of seeming in the way. Would all the guests come in here to eat? And if so, where would she hide? As if to answer her question, the mistress pushed through the door with a boy behind her. "Hurry!" she said. She supervised while the last of the food was transferred from the iron kettles into the great china basins, which the cook and the boy carried from the kitchen to some other part of the house. The mistress mumbled and grumbled orders, and in between complained of the guests who made herself out to be a lady when she was nothing but a factory girl putting on fancy airs. Putting on fancy airs, what do you think that means? Somebody who is pretending to be something that they're not, right? So she's saying she's just from the factory. She's not actually, a rich girl. She's just pretending. If the mistress saw Lyddie sitting in the corner, she never let on. Lyddie was glad to be ignored. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever just kind of wanted to hide in the shadows and just blend in? I think everybody has at one point. She needed time and a chance to wash and change her dusty clothes. If only she hadn't worn her better homespun to travel in. The one in the gunny sack was even tighter and more ragged. She hadn't a new dress since they sold the sheep 4 years ago. Since then, her body had begun to make those strange changes to womanhood that exasperated her. Why couldn't she be as thin and straight as a boy? Why couldn't she have been a boy? Perhaps then her father would not have had to leave. With an older son to help, maybe he could have made a living for them on the hill farm. But hard as she wished, hard as she tried, she was only a girl. She was, as girls go, scrawny and muscular, yet her boyish frame had in the last year betrayed her. Her breasts were small and her hips only slightly curved, but she couldn't help resenting these visible signs that she was doomed to be female. So you have to think about that time. They didn't think girls could really work on the farm, and just the boys mostly did. So a lot has changed since this time. But at this time, she feels like being a girl is more liability, right? It's something that she wishes she wasn't, because maybe she could have had things be different for her if she could have stayed with her family and worked on the farm. Even the last year before Papa left, he had begun sending her to help her mother. So remember, at this time, they thought the girls should do what the women did, which was be at home and clean and cook and take care of the children in the home. And the boys usually went with the papas and they would work on the farm. She's never really got over the baby's birth, he'd say about their mama. But once there was no more wool to spin, she felt as though her presence in the house just made her mother try less. One by one, the household tasks had been turned over to Lyddie, cooking and churning and cleaning and caring for the babies. For a while her mother spun the flax. They had no loom and paid the village weaver and spun flax for cloth. Her father had left them in a new shirt her mother had made, but that was the last garment her mother sewed. Lyddie tried to keep up the spinning, but when she had to take her father's place outdoors, she was too exhausted to try to spin and sew in the dim candlelight. Last winter she sewed one shirt. She had made it for Charlie because he too was outgrowing his clothes, and the old wool shirt her father had left behind hung on him like a nightdress. As it turned out, Mistress Cutler provided her with a store-bought calico gown. It was softer than her own rough brown homespun, and it fit her much better, but somehow it suited her less. How could she enjoy the garment of her servitude? She was She was fit with new boots as well. They pinched her feet and made her long to go barefoot, but she wore them, if not meekly, at least with determined obedience. After a few weeks and many blisters, they softened a little, and she was able to forget them for an hour or so at a time. Ooh, the people at Cutler's were not so easy to forget. The mistress was large in body and seemed to be everywhere on watch. How could a woman so obviously rich in this world's goods be so mean in the use of them? Her eyes were narrow and close, and always on sharp for the least bit of spilt flour or an odd crumb on the lip. So it's like she's almost always watching for her to do something wrong, right? Have you ever had somebody like that, where it's like they're watching you all the time? Oh, that can be very exhausting and stressful. Not that Lyddie would stoop to steal a bite of bread, but the boy, Willie Hyde, was given to snatching the last of the loaf as he carried the bread basket from the table to the kitchen. He was a year or so older than Charles, and growing like a red birch, and to hear the mistress carry on about as useless. He was sent to the shed or barn or field whenever he was not needed in the tavern itself. Lyddie would not have said so, but she envied him the chance to be outdoors and out of boots so often. Mistress Cutler watched Lyddie like a barn cat on a sparrow, but Lyddie was determined not to give her cause for complaint. She had worked hard since she could remember, but now she worked even harder, for who was there to spare a moment's leisure with? Meaning, she had no one to play with. She just worked and worked. Who would listen with her to bird call, stare at the sunset, or watch a calf stumble on its long, funny legs towards its mother? Missing Charlie was like wearing a stone around her neck. What do you think that means? Think about that. Wearing a big stone around her neck. How would that feel to wear a heavy rock around your neck? Oh, that burden, but always there and heavy. And that's how it feels to her to miss her brother. She slept under the eaves in a windowless passage, which was hot and airless even in the late spring. She was ordered to bed late and obliged to rise early, for the mistress was determined that no paying guest in the windowed rooms across the narrow passageway should know that they shared the floor with the kitchen girl. So she went to bed late and she woke up early. She spoke rarely, but she listened intently, storing up stories for Charlie. She didn't consider writing him. She was ashamed to have Charlie see her poor penmanship and crude spelling, and besides, there was no money for paper or postage, nothing except the calf money, and she could not spend half a penny of that. Indeed, at night, when she was too tired or too hot to sleep, she would take the gunny sack out from under her straw mattress and count the money in the darkness. It's like little Agnes sucking her thumb, she scolded herself, but she didn't stop. It was the only comfort she had that summer. Okay, so we're near the end here of chapter 3. We're on the top of page 25. I hope you're following along with me. It was nearly September when she saw the pink silk lady again. She had come this time from the coach from Burlington and was headed, Lyddie overheard her stay at supper, for Lowell, Massachusetts. When another traveler asked her business in Lowell, she smiled and said, "Why, I work in the Hamilton mill there. Yes," she added, answering the questioner's stare. "I'm one of those factory girls." The man murmured something and turned his face toward his bowl of stew. The lady watched him, still smiling, and then, catching Lyddie's eyes, smiled even more broadly, as though to imply that Lyddie was a comrade in some peculiar way. In other words, like a teammate, like they're in on something together, or somehow similar. Indeed, when the men had left the dining room to go into the tap room, she stayed behind, reading a book she had taken from a small silk purse that matched her lovely dress. "I've seen you before, haven't I?" Lyddie looked around to see whom the lady was speaking, then realized the room was empty except for the two of them. "In late May, when I was headed home to the farm for summer." Lyddie cleared her throat. She had lost the habit of conversation. She nodded. "You're not one of the family here." Lyddie shook her head. "You're a good worker, I can see that." Lyddie nodded again to acknowledge the compliment and turned again to loading the dirty dishes on her tray. "You do well in the mill, you know. You'd clear at least $2 a week and—" she paused. "You'd be independent." She was lying. Lyddie was sure of it. No girl could make that much money in a week's time. "It's hard work, but maybe easier than you do here, and you'd have some time to yourself to study or just rest." "My mother's promised me here," Lydia said quickly, because the door from the kitchen was moving, and suddenly Mistress Cutler was in the dining room. The woman looked from the lady to Lyddie, opening her mouth to speak, but Lyddie didn't wait. She hurried past her into the kitchen. That night again she counted the calf money. The lady had been lying, of course, but still, how had a farmer's daughter bought a silk dress? Was the lady lying? And what do you think Lyddie will do? All right, I hope that you enjoyed chapter 3 and that you're ready to jump into chapter 4. And if you don't have the book yet, you can listen to chapter 4 on YouTube. All right, thank you, 7th graders. I hope you're enjoying the book. And if you have some extra time, feel free to read ahead. That's always a good thing to do. Bye.